So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for spending your lunchtime with us. There is a lot of food, so please do feel free to just keep getting up and stuffing your face as we go through, because there's a lot there. Coffee and teas are over there as well, so yeah. So my name is Dr. Jenna Ashton. I'm a lecturer in Heritage Studies, and I'm also the research lead for Creative and Civic Futures at Creative Manchester. And for those of you who don't know, Creative Manchester is an interdisciplinary research platform here at the university. And the platform champions research in creativity and creative practice, and we bring together research communities with different external stakeholders and partners to explore new research areas and address strategic opportunities. So one of the themes we have within Creative Manchester is Creative and Civic Futures. And this semester we have 3 events, and this is the second of those events in this research cafe format. And so it's where we bring together a panel of different disciplinary literacies, I suppose, to kind of respond to a particular theme. The first research cafe was Plants in Civic Futures, and that was actually recorded, so you can actually find that online if you missed it. And this is Materials in Civic Futures, and then the third one in a week or so is Animals in Civic Futures. So Materials in Civic Futures is kind of interesting, actually, because it sort of sits between plants and animals as this sort of interconnecting really between bodies of different kinds of, sort of plants and animals. So Materials is an interesting one, I think. And for me, the reason why I wanted to do Materials is because there seems to be a real, a kind of crunch point almost, I think, in civic discourse, in civic conversation around materials in terms of production and consumption. And so I think the 3 people we have today can speak really interestingly to that. So I'm going to introduce each of the speakers. They're going to have roughly sort of 5-6 minutes to sort of, pitch their sort of research approach and interest and summary to you. Then we'll have a discussion up here after that, and then we'll open it out to the floor. Okay, so I'll just go through the biography. So the first person to present will be Helen Holmes. Helen is a senior lecturer in sociology at the Sustainable Consumption Institute in the university, and her work explores consumption and diverse forms of economy, including circular economy. Helen has worked on multiple interdisciplinary projects, including a funded study called One Bin to Rule Them All. She is Bin Lady, that explores the barriers and challenges to household plastic recycling. Her most recent book, The Materiality of Nothing, great title, draws together Helen's research expertise on the social practices of consumption, waste and disposal and their relevance to environmental sustainability. And Helen is Deputy Director of the University of Manchester's Sustainable Futures platform, and this is a collaboration with them, this cafe today. Then after that, we will move on to Catherine Casson. In the middle. Catherine will be talking about I'm not going to tell you what she's going to talk about. So Catherine is a senior lecturer in enterprise and medieval history in the Alliance Manchester Business School, and her work explores medieval entrepreneurship, including projects on reputation and economic performance and competitive strategies in medieval English towns. She also has looked at property markets in medieval England, enterprise and urban development, and her most recent book, Property, Power and the Growth of Towns, Enterprise and Urban Development from 1100 to 1500, explores the role of local enterprise in the growth of medieval towns. And Catherine is a member of the Centre for Medieval and Early Modern History and associate member of the Sustainable Consumption Institute. And then finally, but by no means least, we'll have Claudia Henninger. So Claudia is a reader in fashion marketing management, and her research explores the circular economy and collaborative forms of consumption within the fashion industry. And her work has been published in the European Journal of Marketing, the Journal of Fashion Marketing and Management, and the International Journal of Management Review. And she has edited a variety of books on sustainable fashion, including Sustainability in Fashion, a Cradle to Upcycling Approach. And Claudia is the chair of the Academy of Marketing, SIG, Sustainability and Creative Manchester's Challenge Lead for Creative Industries and Innovation. So, with that in mind, I'm going to shut up and I'm going to pass over to Helen and then to Catherine and then to Claudia. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. So I was a little bit unsure about what to talk about today because all of my research is on materials. So I've spent 15 years, long time, researching materials and objects, So I'm particularly interested in the material cultures of a really diverse set of things. So my book, for example, which I've brought along today to plug, might as well, includes things like hair, plastic, music, objects associated with being thrifty, and also lost property. So I wanted to sort of focus today on an aspect of the book which I think speaks quite well to materials in Civic Futures, but also being mindful of the fact that I'm only supposed to be talking for 5 minutes, and I could really waffle on for a really long time. So I'll try and be a bit conscious of that. So the book, as Jenna said, is about the materiality of nothing. And I think this is quite important because actually when we think about the invisible, the intangible and the transient, they're actually often missing from studies of material culture. So these are things that we don't see or we don't fully realise the material properties of. So, for example, my work on plastic has revealed that lots of people don't realise that there are polymers in all sorts of different things, from food to paint to the wipes, that we all had during the pandemic. They're literally everywhere. To also things that we can't see or can only be seen by a trained eye, such as asbestos, or literally things which are invisible, like nanomaterials. So I'm interested in all of these things, and I'm interested in the transient things which shift shape, which alter, which are really hard to pin down. So a lot of this came about from I did a Holsworth fellowship here quite a while ago on thrift. And I was talking to people about the sorts of objects and things that they used around the home to be thrifty. Lots of people started talking about things that they no longer had. So my usual question is to all of you, I want you all to think of something that you've lost, that you really remember, and there's a resonance to that thing even though you no longer have it, because that is just what this book is about, and I'm going to tie this into Civic Futures, hopefully. So I'm interested in the resonances and the connections of the materiality of nothing and what they can tell us about our relationship to material things, but also how those understandings of material nothingness can inform the pursuit of sustainability, which is where all of my research is seemingly heading, even though I am pulling back a bit and trying to do some stuff on rave music, but keep getting told off for doing that. But I've managed to weave it in anyway. So the book, it is open access if anybody wants to have a look at it. It's published by Routledge. Very briefly, we have a chapter that's all about loss and the connections we have to lost things. There's a chapter around the practices and processes of disposal and how getting rid of stuff is a difficult and fraught process. It's not easy. It's not just a case of throwing something in the bin. And then that moves on to thinking about how these connections travel through the practices of acquisition and circulation. From the embodied memories of passed on things, you've probably all been given something by a relative at some point, and how that evokes certain memories, to the imagined others that we think about that live in passed on things, or things that we might buy from a charity shop or second hand. And then that moves on to thinking about the ignored, the unseen, or the hidden, and their performative capacities. So thinking about nanomaterials, thinking about the performative capacities of hair in a strange way. And then the chapter I'm going to focus on today is about the paradox of this fragility and persistence of matter, and how decay in particular, and this is a current interest of mine, is managed, negotiated, and in some cases celebrated. So I think it's this chapter on decay for me that really, there's resonance throughout the book which sits with regards to materials and civic futures, but I think it's this decay aspect that I want to pick up on. And I do apologise if anyone came to my book launch, because it was this chapter I focused on then as well, so I am being a little bit lazy. So I'll own up to that now, because there is also a recording of that. So what is it about decay? So the work I've done around decay draws a lot on a project I did all about lost property. So I went around basically asking people about things that they'd lost, and what memories and associations were attached to those lost things. So from that, it became apparent that in some cases, decay is enabled and celebrated with material things, whilst in others we work really hard to prevent it, and value is really central to those sorts of decisions. And if we think about cultural institutions, they're a great example of this. There are decisions made about whether to conserve or whether to restore something, the former being a focus on keeping the object in its current state, while the latter is about bringing it back to its original condition. And so some of the interviews I did for the Lost Property Project were with a cultural institution, and some of you may know what I'm talking about now, but I'm not going to name it. So to give you an example of where decay is valued, there is a museum not too far from here that has a number of social movement banners, and some of these have lots of sticky tape on them with dirt from different marches. And there is no move to remove any of that, because actually that dirt and that decay are part of those banners' history. So in that case, that's something that celebrated those connections to another time. And I think when we think about that, and we think about the resonances of that idea, we can think about the resonances with loss as well. So many of you may have heard on the news that last week there was a fire at the Copenhagen Stock Exchange. And for me, there's been lots of similarities with that drawn to the Notre Dame fire in 2019. So there's this desire, isn't there, to urgently save these historic sites from loss. Particularly with Notre Dame, there was a big crowdfunding campaign. But you may remember from that crowdfunding campaign, there was lots of critics as well about whether that money should be going to restoring an old building or whether it should be focused on saving the natural habitats that are around us. So I think that raises certain questions. What from our civic futures should we preserve and save? What should we be celebrating the decay of? And what should we be trying to stall that decay or speed it up in other instances? So another thing this chapter talks about, and I'm not going to go on too much longer because I probably already have my 5 minutes, are replicas. So I think we also see practice of decay when we think about replicas. So this might be, and again, the case of cultural institutions where originals might be too fragile or too important to be put out on display. So again, the same museum example has a 150-year-old food item from a very significant historical event. They can't put that food item out on display because it wouldn't survive. So a replica is in its place. So for me, these replicas challenge those material connections that we have to things. They can't hold the same traces as the origins, but they can enable that somatic engagement. So as we see here, there's a celebration of decay in some instances and not in others. And that also occurs in households. So if we think about the role of patina and the sensorial and embodied practices of decay that are enabled through that, such as a warm wedding ring or a well-thumbed book, those aspects of decay are celebrated within those material things. So there's lots of decisions made, I think, about what should be kept for future generations. And that's within cultural institutions. It's with everyday household objects as well. What should we keep? What should we pass on? But who decides what gets kept and what gets passed on? And who decides what should be left to decay or what should be preserved or conserved? So I think that's really important. And then another aspect that came up in this particular chapter is the notion of material disconnect. So what do we do when preservation is not possible? Perhaps because one object is dependent on another object. So we've probably all got maybe cupboards and drawers of defunct technologies at home. So things that you can no longer use, cassettes, tapes, because you don't have the technology to be able to use them. So one of my examples in the book is a VHS tape, which you need a video player for, which there are not many of those around anymore. So there's loads of examples of that. And in these instances, these material connections that we have to things are broken. The connections between the objects and the connections they enable, their sensorial, memories, memorial and also embodied connections are gone. So what's the answer? And what's the answer for materials in civic futures? Is the answer alternatives to material accumulation? You know, we're seeing a big rise in the digital, aren't we? You know, lots of VR experience type things. And it's often seen, I think, as the panacea to the crisis of accumulation that we're all facing. But that in itself is really resource intensive. And I think my argument with the whole book is that there is a real pull of the tangible. People want to own things and they want to possess things. They want to and desire material things. So we're seeing this with the big resurgence in vinyl at the moment, and also analogue photographs have apparently come back in. So there's a shunning of these digital forms, which I think is really interesting. It's certainly interesting for thinking about materials within civic futures. So people want to be able to hold, they want to possess, and they desire the connections that those material things enable and enable them to have. So my question is, what does that mean for materials in civic futures?
Okay, so I'm going back in time a little bit, and I'm going to talk about a collaborative project called Histories and Futures of the Circular Economy, and Helen was also involved in this as one of the co-authors. So this project was a collaboration between medieval historians such as myself and colleagues in the Sustainable Consumption Institute, and basically came about because some of us were in the same department together and got talking about our research. So the gap we noticed is that existing literature on sustainable consumption from both disciplines tends to focus on the period 1700s onwards. There's been very little work on the period prior to that. So we decided to examine the key decisions taken by medieval consumers and producers regarding the disposal of items. I'm just going to give you an outline of some of the findings and the methodology we used. So our research questions were, what were the industries in which there were the greatest opportunities for recycling and reuse? What were the incentives and deterrents? And how were these impacted on by practical issues and by the institutional framework? We drew our evidence from documents such as court records and documents produced by national government, and also archaeological reports, reports of excavations where the actual objects themselves had been found. So just before I give you some of the results, it's useful to give you a little bit of context to what's actually happening in England during the period 1250 to 1500, which is when we're studying. So we often think of this as a very backward time, but in fact, most research has shown that really during this period, 1250 to 1500, England is experiencing a kind of commercial and industrial revolution, almost on par with what Manchester went through in the 18th and 19th centuries. So the result of this is that there's more towns being founded, existing towns are getting larger, and more markets are being created where people can trade. So basically, the number of places to buy and sell goods and the number of consumers are both growing. So there are highly skilled labour-intensive craft occupations, and these are a significant part of the manufacturing sector. And most of the processes are reliant on organic materials, as you would expect, such as wood, metals, clay, and wool. And these are obviously time-consuming to collect compared to today and could fluctuate in availability. So what this means, by and large, is that there are incentives for repair, reuse and recycling, as the acquisition of raw materials and the production processes are both labour-intensive, but also, and something we perhaps would otherwise forget, there are alternatives available in the form of new goods. So this is a sophisticated economy. So Helen's mentioned a bit about our practices today, but what are the opportunities for disposing of items in the Middle Ages? Well, the first one is obviously repair. So archaeological evidence reveals that people did do repairs to household objects to pull on their use. So, for example, bowls of lead spoons were reattached to handles using solder, and that's probably something that was done by professionals. Also, reuse was important through gift or by sale. So wills show that it was common to bequeath clothing and household items to servants to aid them in setting up their own home or business. And there's links to what Helen said that I'll come to in a minute. But also there's a kind of healthy trade in second-hand items. So records of local government show that second-hand markets operated in cities such as London. And we know that members from all walks of life, including the nobility, were willing to buy second-hand objects such as furs. And then finally we come to recycling. This is an area where there are opportunities, but for reasons I'll say in a minute, there was actually little engagement with. So there were opportunities to take surplus material from first stages of production to make it into additional items, and also for waste generated during production to be used to make additional items. But this was actually much less engaged in. So we can identify some industries in which repair, reuse and recycling were most common, which are clothing, metal and leather. But there's also some variations in approaches. So interestingly, in the area of kind of metalworking, repair was sometimes prohibited on health and safety grounds. So in 1322, for example, the Guild of Armourers of London expressed concerns that untrained people are restoring old helmets to look like new and then taking them out into the countryside to sell. And this is both deceptive and dangerous, as repaired helmets would obviously not necessarily offer the same level of protection on the battlefield as a newly manufactured one. We don't find any instances of recycling production waste or surplus for metal, which is actually quite surprising. But these do come up with textiles to a greater extent, but they're also very controversial. So in 1464, for example, legislation was introduced at the National Parliament to prevent the use of threads that came out from the ends of weaving being used as stuffing or quilting for bedding, or as raw materials added into the wool process before it was spun and woven. But for some manufacturers, an exemption was granted because, for example, textile manufacturers in Devon were able to prove that the kind of texture of their finished cloth depended on using these waste bits of material from earlier stages of production being added into the wool. But clearly this is like quite a controversial issue. So what then are the are the incentives for repair, reuse and recycling? Well, we can broadly say there are two groups. The first is kind of practical and physical. So cost of manufactured items, and this perhaps is the biggest difference to today. So the cost of items obviously reflects the labour input and the raw materials, and this provides a clear incentive for reuse by repair and for gifting. So just to illustrate this, to produce a piece of cloth in the 1540s took a total of 978 hours and could involve expensive imported dyes. So to put that into context in terms of purchasing power, if you wanted to buy 4 square yards of the finest quality woolen cloth, you would be, as a labourer, spending 124% of your monthly income, even as a craftsman, 78%, and as a merchant, so particularly wealthy, 15%. So to buy textiles is a significant outlay for your monthly income. Free, in inverted commas, domestic labour facilitated opportunities for repair. So during this period, the social norm was that married women were not expected to work outside the household. So therefore, they had the time to engage in repairs and were also, in linking with Helen's paper, expected to care for and conserve items to actually avoid them being damaged in the first place and to prolong their use. So practical and physical incentives are one group, but there's also institutional incentives. And here there's, again, an overlap with Helen's work. So the first is commemoration. This is integral to medieval religious belief and is emphasising the need to pray for the soul of dead people. So gifts, such as those to servants in the will, ensure that the deceased is remembered and prayed for by the recipient. So there's a bit of a self-serving motive here. There's also an idea of enhancing family status. So precious metal objects such as jewellery would be passed down through generations. We're kind of familiar with this today. But in addition, wealthy families in many localities would bequeath metal objects and textiles to their local churches. Again, partly out of a philanthropic motive, partly out of a desire to speed up their time going through purgatory and getting an easy entrance into heaven. So those are the incentives. But what about the deterrents? Well, again, there's kind of a couple of groups. So the first, perhaps surprisingly, is changes in fashion. So there were fashions in the Middle Ages, especially in relation to shoes, particularly in relation to the length of the toe. So what we find in rubbish dumps in London, for example, is that there are many pairs of barely worn pointy shoes that have been dumped, which were unfashionable after about, a period in the 1330s. And so they're discarded after very little wear and used as landfill as sort of flood barriers in the River Thames. But institutional barriers are arguably more significant. So the first barrier is an association with theft. Local government feared that the second-hand markets were basically outlets for stolen goods and that were causing problems for maintenance of law and order. The second issue is that manufacturers of new goods see second-hand goods as a threat. And so we often see manufacturers of new goods petition against the sale of second-hand items. And finally, as I've hinted at already, consumer protection deterred recycling. So manufactured goods are generally sold by members of trade organisations who accredit the quality of the items sold by their members and regulate the range of goods sold. So one of the concerns is that the use of, for example, surplus material from production might be exploited to defraud consumers who won't understand what they're buying. So I'll just conclude with the medieval findings and then give a couple of hints to kind of future directions. So basically what we've seen is that the reuse of objects in the Middle Ages is promoted by resource scarcity and the costs of replacement products, but also by institutional practices surrounding gifting and commemoration. So reuse via repair and gifting occurs in the domestic environment, but there's also a substantial commercial trade in second-hand items and repairs. Yet while there's consumer demand for second-hand items and repairs, institutional barriers to these practices are created by trade organisations, local and central government, and these are based on consumer protection and also the concern about the competition for new goods. So finally, can we draw anything out of this for today? Well, there are perhaps a few things we can maybe consider. So the first thing is the reuse of items between households remains common. So one of the case studies that often comes up is, for example, the reuse of maternity clothing between women. But in contrast, compared to the medieval period, there are fewer incentives for households today to engage with repair. There's a range of reasons for this, but they include mass production, lowering the costs of new items, the complexity of product design, making it difficult to actually work out how to do the repair, women's role changing, so they're primarily outside of the home, and also limited access to skilled repairers. So one argument is that if we make the act of repair more attractive to do and more convenient, it will re-engage people in doing it. And likewise, if we encourage companies to design products differently in a way that it allows repair and reuse, for example, by providing instructions and videos on how to take things apart, that may also help re-incentivize this. The other thing that's interesting is recycling. So in the Middle Ages, as we've seen, opportunities for recycling are underexploited. In contrast, there's some work that's been done today that suggests that today we've gone too far the other way and that we're trying to recycle too many and too wide a range of items. And that some perhaps of these are actually damaging the natural environment during the recycling process. So there's a group of scholars who propose that really we need to refocus recycling towards materials where we know we're adding value when we reprocess them, and also that more needs to be done to get the input of manufacturers into identifying those. So thank you.
So I think my research actually fits right in between Helen and Catherine. So thanks very much for providing all of the background information. So my research is all about waste. And I think this kind of fits in nicely with the decay that Helen mentioned, but also quite nicely with Catherine, who you say medieval times and recycling and everything else. So my context is fashion, and one of the things that you can also see there, it's quite cyclical. So when you actually look, historically speaking, what happened, so you already heard from Catherine, when we traditionally think about fashion, it wasn't affordable to anyone. So it was just the very wealthy who were actually able to buy new clothes, and everybody else got hand-me-downs. And it kind of comes back, but with a very different kind of thought process. So if you think about hand-me-downs, it's probably sometimes also a badge of honor, because you might be wearing something that actually might have belonged to someone, whether or not this is jewellery, and you look at it and you think well, actually, that's something that, triggers a memory for me, and it's something that I really wanted to. Other times, it's also, you might wear something where you think, I wished I didn't have to, but because my cousin is older than me and happens to be just about this slightly bit taller and older than me, I just need to wear it because the clothes are there, so why would you buy anything new? But it's kind of thinking about how things are actually working out. So one of the interests that I have is about value and worth. So when we look at the fashion industry, as we heard from Catherine, it's now, obviously, there's not a lot of need to repair things because we can just go on a high street and buy it very cheap because the prices are massively reduced. So, and if you don't have the skills, when you think about fashion industry, I think there's a lot of skills that have been lost. So if you think about, for example, sewing on a button, some of you might know how to do this. Other people might say, well, actually, this is the biggest struggle for me. So if a button falls off my blouse, I can't fix it. I don't know anybody who can fix it, so therefore it's damaged goods for me. I need to give it away because I can't wear it anymore. And it's just, it might sound a little bit ridiculous when you think, oh, but it's just a button and you can sew the button on. But this can actually be a massive hindrance to actually then being able to repair something because we just lost those skills and we just don't know how to do it. And then if you think about what is the value in it, so how much value do we actually still have in our clothes and how much do they really mean to us? So when we think about fashion, most people associate it probably with high street and fast fashion, and we probably don't have this connection anymore with it. If we think about our wardrobes, unfortunately, I'm also sometimes guilty of this. If I look at it, I actually do have quite a large wardrobe. But it's a collection of things, and I think I've got some stuff in there that I've bought about 15 to 20 years ago. I still fit in, and every now and again I just take it out because I think, oh, actually, this is the occasion, and I can just wear it again. Or I get something from my mom, and I'm like, well, actually, I really like this. I'm just going to wear this. But it's sort of like understanding like where's the value coming from, and how do we actually really appreciate materials. In the fashion industry as well, we see a lot of changes. So when Helen talked about, for example, like invisible things like nanomaterials, at the moment we've got a problem with microfibers because we've got a lot of clothes that are made from plastics, and unfortunately they're shedding quite a lot. So in recent media there has been a lot of focus on this, but it's actually not just the plastics that are shedding, but it's also natural materials. So this is a little bit of a myth that sort of like needs to be spread. It's just a myth because all our clothing are actually releasing those fibres. What happens to them, we don't actually know, or how we actually deal with them, and that's kind of like a research problem that we have, but that we need to look at, because obviously we've got more and more garments that are in circulation, and actually we wouldn't need to produce anything anymore, because we've got so many clothes that for the next generations we've got enough on the planet. And that's it. We just don't need anything anymore. But still, because there's a demand there from people who say, well, actually, I still want to have all of this, and I still want to, like engage in it. I still want to own something. And this is also when Helen was talking a little bit about, or Catherine as well, about the ownership of things. So within the fashion industry, and it kind of like links to the circular economy, they're trying to move away from ownership, or at least give incentives to do so. So maybe you're just renting something or you're swapping something. But when we look at cultural backgrounds, and if you also think about personally like how we feel about it, if we suddenly don't own anything anymore, how does this actually make us feel as a society? What does it mean about us? What is it kind of like about your identity that might be there or might not be there anymore? Because if you think about, I don't know, for example, having the first interview, and you had your first interview, and you like, I still remember what I wore on my first interview. I still have the outfit at home. Would I give it away? Probably not, because I thought that was actually a super lucky outfit, that it got everything sorted, so clearly I'm going to keep it. But if I would have rented it, well, I wouldn't have this anymore. So I couldn't tell everyone, like, look at this, I've worn this however many times, that was my lucky outfit, still belongs to me. But if you're suddenly renting something, it's sort of like, well, you're taking this away. On the one hand, this is great, because then, well, maybe everybody could wear this lucky outfit and everybody gets a job. So that would be amazing. But obviously you can't keep it in your wardrobe. So it's kind of like the chicken and egg question of like, what is it actually that you really want out of this? And that's why I feel it's like the value and the worth of it. So it's just like making sure that we are rethinking how we actually, especially with fashion, how we think about it, because we need to start valuing what we actually have and making the most out of it, and also understanding that there's a lot of worth in clothing. So at the moment, and that again fits with what Helen probably is also interested in with like the One Bin project, about what is actually being discarded and where things are being discarded off. So a lot of garments, because if they're damaged, you can't give them away to charity anymore, because you might feel, well, why would I, like if I've got a massive stain on a shirt, why would I give this away to anyone? Because nobody wants to have a stained t-shirt, let's be honest. But there is nowhere else where we can actually put it apart from the household bin, because we don't actually know like where's the nearest recycling centre that would actually take this stained material and could still be making some use out of it. So at the moment we've got a lot of value actually in landfills, and that's something that's probably coming up historically speaking. I don't even want to know what generations after I think, when there's suddenly all of those mountains of literally wasted garments and materials, and they think, well, what kind of society was this? So it's kind of like it needs a lot of research to also understand like how are we actually dealing with problems that have accumulated, that sort of like have become even bigger through history. And I think it's quite nice to actually see like how things are coming up and what you can learn from history as well. And we also need to rethink, I feel, of what we previously have done.
Okay, amazing. Thank you, guys. So, so I'm just going to kind of summarise then some of the points, then maybe we'll dive a little bit deeper. So, yeah, so some kind of obvious key concepts there around repair, waste, discard, decaying, accumulation. In terms of objects themselves, banners, biscuits, rings, helmets, pointy shoes, lucky outfits. I love that idea about the pointy shoes being the Thames barrier. I thought that was hilarious. But yeah, so all of these things, so in terms of the challenges then, we seem to be getting caught up around issues of values and worth and actual sort of practical costs in different ways, and then incentives and disincentives. So something that I'd like maybe each of you to kind of tease out for us a little bit more is, and you've kind of all touched upon it a little bit, is around this thing, I suppose, of material literacies. So actually, within the periods that you're studying, within the research projects, do people really understand about materials, like the actual thing? So not so much even the thing it becomes, but the stuff. See, I haven't even got the language. This is where we need people from materials in the room. The actual sort of natural or synthetic compounds that are sitting within everything around us. What's been your sense of that within your projects, Helen? I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I can certainly have a go. So funnily enough, I've been thinking about this on another project, this concept of material literacy, and I think it's a real issue. I think there's a growing sense of understanding more around the value of things, but I don't think that's broken down to sort of more of the molecular level that you're mentioning there. So, for example, Claudia's great example about microfiber release. Lots of people still have no idea that every time you wash your clothes that happens and where that's going, and there's evidence to suggest that it's residing in all the ecosystems around us, including the air. And I think that is a concern, but I do think people are becoming a bit more switched on to the value of things, and the case in point, I think, I'm sure many of you have maybe used Vinted before, these circulation platforms that are available, recognising that I might not want something anymore, but somebody else might. So I think there is a recognition around the value of stuff and around the fact that we can't keep consuming in the way that we do. But I think, as I said, at that more science materials level, I don't think that's there. And why would it be, really? Because it's not a course we offer in schools, is it? Material literacy, maybe it should be. You heard that first here, before the government introduced it. I don't know. I think there needs to be a better understanding, of the not just the clothes, but everything around us. The everyday objects that we use, that function our lives, and what they mean. But in doing so, you've got to understand where they've come from and where they're going at the other end as well. So how is that glass jug going to be disposed of? Is it going to be recycled? What bin should it go in? What will happen next? Can it be reused in some way? Really breaking that down, but that's difficult.
Then in the medieval period, I'm going to make a huge assumption here. Did people have a better material literacy because of the skills and craft required to make stuff?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have the sort of much direct evidence on that, but I would have said yes, basically. Like, just before I came out here, I was reading something about medieval Coventry, and it said in Coventry in about the 1400s, around 30% of the population were engaged in textile manufacturing, and that's just one town. So textile manufacturing is in multiple towns across the UK in sort of the 14th century, then it moves into the countryside in the 15th. So pretty much, unless you maybe lived in the West Midlands, which was less of it, almost certainly you would be somehow involved in the wool production or in the weaving or in the processing. So I think people did have a very clear idea of where certainly their wool, and it was primarily wool, where their wool came from. So yes, it was probably fairly straightforward.
And is there any evidence of these earlier periods of the kind of just stop oil kind of, that the way that language, I mean, that's the kind of, I suppose that's what I'm kind of interested in, is the fact that within civic activism, that 3-word sort of slogan is kind of there. But I wonder if how people understand that or engage with it. And I just wondered, in these earlier periods, do we have evidence of anything like that?
They are interested in it, so they do recognise the concept of resource depletion. Okay. That's for sure. They recognise it, but where they recognise it is mainly in relation to things like rivers. Mm-hmm. So the big worry is about fish stocks and animal stocks. Mm-hmm. They also understand about pollution in terms of, so the pollution from, say, leather processing going into water, and the associated problems both for other industries and also for health. So there's certainly an understanding, and also dyeing. So in that sense, yes, they understand that resources are not, some resources are infinite. Well, they don't quite understand. They understand about conservation of resources. They don't probably quite understand that resources could end, and they understand about pollution. But obviously, that sort of, at this stage, there's not really a kind of concerted issue. When there are issues, it tends to be, unfortunately, things to do with who is working in the textile trade. So when, for example, the king encourages migrants to come in from other countries, that tends to be the bigger clash, which there's a big body of literature on as well. But so they recognise this issue, but they're not entirely doing this for environmental reasons. It is more sort of motivated by other concerns.
Yeah, it's interesting. So Claudia, then kind of connecting that into your work. So the actual kind of literacy around materials and what they are. How does that connect into your stuff in terms of either the circular economy work or this issue around waste? And
so I think people don't necessarily understand all of the materials, because if you think about how many materials we have that actually make up our clothes, not many people read labels. You might just about read a label for washing purposes, but maybe you just think, oh, you know what, I'm washing everything at 30 degrees and I'm just putting it in, maybe colour coordinates. So I'm not sure who actually looked the last time at a label in their garments. I can honestly say, like, probably not for many years, because I roughly guess what I'm actually doing. But it's also when you talk to people and you say, well, there's finite resources. There's natural materials, there's synthetic materials, but there's also man-made materials that are made from natural products but are still synthetically made, but still based on natural raw materials. And that's where, like, everything kind of like becomes a little bit difficult and challenging. I mean, like, if we think about viscose, technically speaking, yeah, it's a natural fibre, but it's man-made. So, and there's a lot of processes involved, there's a lot of chemicals and everything else involved. And we don't actually fully understand, as consumers at least, what we are wearing. So even if I know I'm wearing a cotton shirt, we don't understand, like, what are the dyeing processes. So how many chemicals am I actually wearing on my skin just by wearing something that is actually from a natural fibre? And then that also, like, reflects into being able to recycle it, because a lot of our garments, they're not monomaterials, so there's multiple materials mixed together. And we currently have an issue of actually recycling mixed materials. So there are some processes in place where companies have, for example, developed this machine where you can put a jumper in and you get a jumper out. It doesn't matter what the material is, because you're just using the same sort of like thing. That works, but it might not necessarily be scalable. And for everything else, it's sort of like understanding, if we put a polycotton t-shirt, so something made out of polyester and cotton, and we try to recycle it, really, really difficult, because they all got different kind of like points where, like, things are melting. So, for example, plastics do melt, and then you might not actually be able to do it. Natural fibres, they're flammable, so there's also that kind of like an issue of what you're actually doing. Some of them need to be mechanically recycled. There's some that need to be kind of like chemically recycled, and then you haven't even, like, talked about the new materials made out of, I don't know, like bacterial cellulose, or you've got pineapple fibre, or you've got mycelium, or any, like, all of the other things. You haven't even talked about any of this. So yeah, I think it's super difficult, and I don't think that people know about it. And unfortunately, some people also don't really care what the material is, as long as they like what they're wearing.
Yeah, which kind of brings us to the point you've all sort of touched upon a little bit, is around this tension between the sort of personal versus organisational versus government-led incentives or disincentives or motivations and intentions as well. So, so Helen, you talked about this, we love stuff issue, in a sense, our desire for stuff. So, yeah, what are the kind of, if we think about futures and civic futures and people being able to sort of influence or engage with where we go towards a sort of reduction in accumulation. I don't know, this is a really big question, sorry. How do we shift between those different tensions, the kind of personal and the organisational and the governmental? Or, I don't know, do you have a particular object that is useful as a way of trying to grasp those tensions? Or yeah.
Not really, but I do sort of come to the conclusion in the book that it's different for different things. So people have sentiments around some of the strangest of things, and there are certain things that people are willing to not own. So there's an example from the Lost Property Project about umbrellas, and there's a great quote, which I can remember, well, they're just fair game, aren't they? You know, an umbrella on a bus, it's, you know, that's for me to use if it's left on a bus. So and I think we've seen that, haven't we? We've seen the increase in like bike sharing schemes, scooter sharing.
It's kind of
schemes.
Values and worth thing again, then.
Yeah. So it's back to the values. So it's, and I think we're pushing the boundaries of what people do find acceptable to share. And again, those sort of platforms, those clothing sharing platforms and reuse platforms are changing things. So 20 years ago in the UK, if you shopped in a charity shop, you know, there was a certain stigma attached to that. You were either very alternative or you were poor. Whereas I think that's really shifted. And actually shopping now, and Claudia will know much better than me, shopping second-hand is actually really trendy. And it's trendy for a variety of reasons. You know, one of those is the sustainability aspect. So I think for me, it's not about we need a reduction of everything. We definitely need a reduction of everything. And you know, if we're thinking about the sort of, going back to my recycling hat, the different sort of R pathways, so repair, reuse, etc. Recycling should be absolutely bottom of that, you know, and a lot of the work I do tends to sound like I'm pushing it as the panacea of everything, which it's not. That should be bottom of that. But I think it's about making more research is needed to understand what are the things that people are willing to share, where can those boundaries be pushed a little bit more, and there are definitely spaces. So, you know, umbrella sharing schemes might be one example. And then I think we can learn from that. So some stuff people seem to want to have that tangible connection with, but other stuff I think they're all right to not own.
It's like a stuff commons. Any thought? I don't know, Catherine, if you've got a response to that.
And I guess the only thing from my experience is that obviously it's quite, like people often look at the Netherlands as an example of somewhere where local authorities are doing quite proactive things with sustainability. I mean, I know there's people trying to do it in this country. So there's things like, you know, sometimes there's what they call the cafes, repair cafes in communities. And I think there's charities that have set up in places where there's one in Levenshulme where you can go and like borrow tools and things like that. But I suppose the issue is that they're often kind of, the coverage is quite patchy. So maybe the repair cafe might not be in every area, or maybe only be once every month or something. You know, the tool library's in Levenshulme, but, you know, if you don't live in Levenshulme, you've still got to get there. So I suppose one of the things would be maybe if there's something that local government could do to more comprehensively set up these areas. But then it comes down to also you need the people who can do the skilled thing, and that's the big problem we have, is that in the Middle Ages, you know, there were many more people who were skilled workers in this area because there was incentive to be. Now, obviously, there has been less of an incentive, and how do you bridge that gap and encourage people to go into these roles? And yeah, that's a difficult issue, and I don't think anyone's really got to the bottom of, you know, is it the case of you pay people more, or some people say no, it's the case that you need to make it more attractive as a job in other ways. So yeah, it's a tricky issue, but that would need to be part of the solution, is having people there who can do the jobs.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Yeah, it kind of links in with what you were saying about the button sewing issue. So yeah, is this how else then is this issue around skills coming out in your work? Or?
I think it's massive, but it's also perceptions and cultures that are actually kind of like influencing everything. I think Helen and I had this discussion like years ago about what you can and cannot share. So I've done a lot of research on swapping, and I found it super fascinating when I went to swap shops, what people find acceptable to swap and what is not acceptable to swap. So I always found it very interesting to sort of like see that it's acceptable to swap things like shoes. And people are more than happy to swap shoes with you know, like whoever. You don't even know that person. But if you like them, you just take them. Which on the one hand is great, but on the other hand, for example, intimates, so your undergarments, absolute no. And I find this super interesting because I always think if I have, let's say, cotton knickers and I could wash them at 90 degrees so I can literally cook them, they're absolutely clean when they're coming out. So there is nothing, and I know there will be nothing on there because everything that could have been on there has been washed off. But if I get a leather shoe from someone, I can't put this leather shoe in a washing machine. Well, I could, but probably at 90 degrees, I don't know what I'm getting out of it anymore. It's probably not the same shoe that I put in. So it's okay to wear somebody's shoes where I don't know where their feet have been, But on the other hand, something that can hygienically clean, I can't use anymore. So my whole sort of like thing about this, and I found this like a really interesting discussion, because I found somebody else that actually then made handbags or anything else out of intimate wear. And I thought, well, it's a good idea. At least, like, you know, you do something with it, because you can't give them to anything or anywhere. So I feel there's also a need for kind of like educational purposes, and also if we think in our society it's not acceptable to do that, which is absolutely fine. But what are we doing with them? So where are they going? They shouldn't go into landfill, because we already established it's a massive problem. So that's when I think authorities or the industry actually don't need to say, well, if this is finished, either send them back and we recycle them, or we've got another facility where we actually give them to. But that's what I thought when we talk about kind of like what can and can you not share, and how does this actually work. I always found this like the best debate. And yeah, if anybody has got any insights into this, more than happy to hear this, because I just thought it was fascinating.
Cooking knickers to do other things with them. That's another research theme. I mean, obviously, what you talked about there about bacteria and then microbes, obviously, from, you know, in terms of decay and mold and so on. Actually, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of other bodies that are involved in materials, and this will probably come up in the animals and Civic Futures issue, obviously, in terms of thinking about animal bodies within material, you know, goods and so on. So yeah, I mean that I suppose feeds into the kind of material literacy stuff, doesn't it? Before we open it up to the floor, what would be something that, you know, if you could, it's a big question, if you could say to people, actually, this is a starting point for really re-engaging with materials and materiality, what would you ask people to do? What would, you know, just as a kind of call now to people in the room, what would be your thing? So Helen, that's how I think maybe.
This takes me back to another lecture that I gave as part of a panel in January.
Triggered. Sorry.
Yeah, triggered again, yeah. And I think for me, it maybe be having a look in your cupboards and your wardrobes at those things that have been sat there for a really long time. We've all got them. I'm working out an alternative path for them. Is there use in those things that somebody else could get out of it, rather than you keeping it, and I am so guilty of this, keeping it sat there doing nothing. So I think that would be mine, and more research funding for this for us to be able to understand what's going on. But that's a wider call to.
And I guess it would probably be put more pressure on kind of manufacturers of new goods to actually encourage repairs that consumers can do. I mean, obviously there's some things where that may be less applicable to, like electricals, but other things where it may be more applicable to. So, and also thinking about, again, maybe how people could learn skills to, say, upcycle things as well is quite interesting. But I think, yeah, basically getting manufacturers more engaged with allowing consumers to repair things where possible and safely.
I would have also said learn a skill, because I feel most people don't really know how things are actually being made, and then when you think about what price you pay for it, once, I mean, like during the pandemic, that was like the only one thing that came out for me that was really positive, is I actually learned how to knit. And then when you actually learn how to knit, then you suddenly think, right, I actually needed 2 months to finish a jumper, and how much would I have paid myself in all of those hours of knitting forwards and backwards, because obviously there's loads of mistakes in between as well that you don't want to show. But it takes a long time. And then if you think like, well, if I would actually pay myself my wages, I would never be able to afford this jumper. But then if you go somewhere else and you look at the shops and you think, wow, that thing is £5, wow, is that expensive? It's sort of like just like really visualizing. And I think more people need to understand how long it actually takes to make something. I mean, obviously we do have machinery and things, so that makes it slightly faster. But still, there is one person who's very skilled and he's put all of the effort in actually making it, and is understanding that this is a lot of value that has been produced, and we should really treasure this and sort of like understand what the worth is.
Yes, that kind of connects to broader social justice issues as well, doesn't it, in terms of those kind of payments and so on. Yeah. Okay, so lots to think about there. So research around sharing that's needed. Skills and skilling and how that is invested in, and then improving kind of material literacies more generally. So we'll kind of open it up now if there's anybody who wants to sort of pitch in, respond to anything that you've heard, or anything that maybe you're doing as well as part of this, or you're kind of like looking into or researching, or groups, anything at all. Any thoughts? And Hazel will mooch with a microphone.
Hello, thank you for your wonderful presentations. And each of you, they mention the aspect of morality in consumption. And it seems to me that it's not a new phenomenon. So now we sort of in depth to nature because we are aware of sustainability and all those kind of media framework of ecological and ethical production. But it seems like in medieval time people was in debt to God because they donated things to their servant, expecting them to pray for them. Could you elaborate on this morality in consumption, how it is helpful in validating materials, in prolongating the use and treasuring them, or it's quite the opposite? Because sometimes it feels like people feel like this morality is imposed on them and they find themselves in the state of denial. I'm not educated in this, so I'm just not buying this sustainability because it is too much for me, and they are staying aside of it. So how do you think it's positive or negative in materiality perception?
I mean, just on the medieval part, kind of the idea, there's quite a lot of literature. There's a book by James Davis called Medieval Morality, who's actually one of the co-authors of our project as well. And he's done a lot about the kind of moral underpinnings of trading in general, which also links into the idea of protecting consumers. So sort of the idea that, you can't expect all consumers to be able to recognise if someone's been trying to deceive them in producing something. So there's a whole idea that a lot of medieval legislation is not so much kind of, or it's not so much in that case obviously about the ease and the path to heaven, that's more the bequest, but this is more about the idea that it's a particularly religious society, and that kind of some of the moral teachings about prices and about kind of how you treat consumers and about almost trade and ethics kind of come into that. It's a bit like when there's literature that's been done later on about the Quakers and about sort of the idea that the Quakers have particular beliefs that kind of help them be considered to be good business people. So you're right that it kind of underpin things. It's probably difficult to say how much that then per se links into the repair, reuse and recycling beyond the commemoration exit thing and beyond the idea that consumers couldn't be defrauded. But it's an interesting thing about the fact that whether that has changed since maybe the Reformation, for example.
Yeah, I can have a go at this. So probably taking a slightly different tack there and thinking about the work that I've done on recycling. So the biggest surprise for us on the recycling project was we deliberately took households that were in different indices of deprivation. So some at the most deprived, some in the least deprived, and some in the middle. And the reason we did that was because there's a bit of a narrative out there that if you're more deprived, you're less likely to care about recycling. And the project absolutely blew that myth out of the water. So whilst the practices may have been a bit different in what went into what bins, and there may have been some slight differences between the different areas, in the interviews, which were very in-depth, we had about 400,000 words of interview data in the end, everybody cared. Now, of course, there's researcher bias there. People are saying that they might care because, you're there talking to them about it. But the things they talked about, travelling miles to be able to recycle things that they couldn't recycle in the local area, saving stuff up to take to supermarket schemes, they were across the board. So I think for me there is that morality that people do want to do the right thing. And I think in this instance, this was plastic recycling. Lots of people have watched Blue Planet. There's that sort of media effect there. But then I think there's also something to raise there, that morality of consumption shouldn't just be placed on the consumer. There is a morality that, as we've already talked about, through the producers, through policy, right to what happens at the end. So, it's really difficult to avoid plastic packaging. If you go out and buy your lunch, it's going to be in a plastic package. You're going to have to make that decision about what bin that goes in. And in Manchester, unfortunately, it's straight in the general waste, unless, like me, you take it home. So I think it's also that morality's got to be wrapped up in the systems as well, and looking at those wider systems, and sort of also just because it really, really annoys me this, but policy have got to get behind that. So when you've got one of our former prime ministers saying that recycling doesn't work, that really doesn't help. So it's got to be a buy-in from all of us, but it's also got to recognise diversity, I think, and the complexity of people's lives. And I could talk more about that if we have time, but on another project.
I think it's just like talking people's language. I mean, like, people are interested in different things. Everybody's got a very different understanding. And sometimes it's quite nice to say, like, well, everybody should, like, buy and do everything super sustainably. But if you're in a situation where you can't actually do things sustainably, for whatever reason that might be, they shouldn't be judged for it. But there should also be, I mean, like, even if you say, well, I don't really care about sustainability, let's say, there should still be then another mechanism to say, well, even if you don't care about sustainability, but if we offer you something that is actually a lot better, and it happens to be sustainable, you might still buy into it. So I think it's just like understanding what languages we need to almost like speak, because we talk to very different consumer groups, and then packaging morality in multiple different ways so that people don't have a chance apart from, well, you actually do need to buy in, but you buy in for very different reasons.
Thank you. So I'm Purnima from Manchester Metropolitan University. The discussion interests me for so many different reasons. One, because it relates to the research work that I do around circular economy and how big corporates kind of frame the concept in their reporting. But more importantly, personally for me, because my research is around circular economy, I think, well, we used to do these things. I grew up doing these things. Like, we never had these names of like, this is repair, recycle. We never knew our hierarchy, but it was part and parcel of like our practices, especially from where I come from. I come from a developing country. And what I notice is that there is a generational difference. I know that like the periodical difference between like the medieval and the current practices was spoken about. But I think there are like very subtle differences between like, say for example, my grandmother's generations to mine. And there is a massive difference in the shift when it comes to the mentality between the 30-year-old me and my 15-year-old cousin, for example, in terms of consumption. For example, like I didn't grow up in a poor household. My parents were well-to-do, but we bought things based on requirement. Like, I wouldn't have got a new piece of clothing unless unless it was a requirement. It was not because my parents could not afford it. You don't need it. You have something to wear. You have a pair of slippers. So why do you need another one? So I wouldn't get one unless my slipper broke, and if it was broken in a way that it couldn't be repaired really, and my parents could like fix a lot of things. But it's completely like if I speak to my cousins now who are just like 10, 15 years younger to me, it's not a thing in them. Like, just buy something for every occasion. You have a new party, you meet a new group of friends because it needs to go on a new Instagram post. The previous clothing went on your post before, so you can't wear the same thing. So there's like a massive shift in mentality between 2 or 3 generations. It's not such a big gap really. So this is something that interests me and amazes me really. So has this kind of like trait come across in terms of like any of the discussions around keeping, not keeping, and personally, like, if I could get into this after my PhD, this is a project that I would get into to explore like the subtle differences in mentality about consumption across like, 2 or 3 generations really.
So I actually find this super fascinating because I feel it's not only between different generations, but it's all between different cultures. So what you highlighted with culturally speaking, this is what we've always done because it's just something that we normally have done. It's quite fascinating. So originally I'm not from the UK, so I'm from Germany originally. If you talk to, for example, my parents' generation, and if you would say, oh, I'm buying second hand, it's it's not something you would openly admit because it has something to do with social status. And that has been handed down from my grandma's generation because obviously there was wartime, so you didn't have anything, you couldn't afford anything, so then you had to buy secondhand. And that automatically sort of like this negative taint came all the way down. So I did research on swapping. So when you look at swap shops, for example, in Germany, they're not in a city centre. They're always on the outskirts of a city. They're always in areas where not everybody would like to go in, simply because not necessarily that they're super dangerous, but it's not an aspiring area to actually walk into, especially not by yourself. And most of the time, they're also linked to religious institutions. So again, they're excluding quite a lot of people who say, well, maybe I'm not part of this religion, maybe I do not want to be part, or go in there. Now, we did a comparison between Germany, the UK, and Finland. So in the UK, it's a badge of honor. You go swapping, it's super cool. You can see it absolutely everywhere. You see all the, pop-up shops. We had one in the university the other day. Everybody is joining in, really, really great. Everybody has got a lot of time. Normally you take your friends, then have a sandwich somewhere, have a chat, go back in. And it's absolutely great. But nobody would have for a second turn around and say, oh, you can't do this. Because it's just something you have. You go in the high street, you see, one of the high street shops, then you see a charity shop, then you see a high-end shop, and it's absolutely normal. When you go to Finland, Finnish people say, well, actually, we've got this bag, and we've got this random name for it, and every single household has this bag. And basically what you do is, when you go to see your family and friends, you take this bag, and then you swap. Because it's a thing to do, because fashion is so expensive, and it doesn't matter if it's first-hand or second-hand, people just say, well, I can't really afford it because it's just so ridiculously priced. So now we all do exactly the same. It's totally acceptable, and it's something, historically speaking, we've always done. So of course this is normal. Of course we do that. But I think this is quite interesting because now when you then look at, say, generations, so whilst my parents' and grandparents' generation would have never thought about second-hand or swapping, my generation and younger generations, they're now, well, of course, we're open for it. And you sort of see very, very slowly a shift. Not in all parts, but it's more like it starts from Berlin because it's super trendy, and it kind of spills down to everywhere else. So I think it's super fascinating to actually look not only at the historical part of it, but also understanding culture, because we've got so many cultural influences. And I think this is also one of the reasons, when we look at swapping, for example, in some cultures, wearing second-hand is a taboo, just because of the beliefs of it, of that you're wearing somebody's second-hand garments. But even those things that were previously taboo, you can see that they're breaking apart because you've been exposed to different cultures, because you've lived somewhere else, because you've interacted with people. So I think that's definitely a super fascinating project about looking at intergenerational, intercultural, sort of prolonging things. So yeah.
Probably not really, because people didn't basically live as long, essentially. So I'd imagine. We see people being left. The wills are from wills of people of different ages are quite comprehensive. So most people did leave things in their will to different family members, young and old. But yeah, it would be hard to be quite as refined as that. So we know that kind of everyone of different age groups was obviously, certainly taking things in wills and was apparently okay with that, and people bequeathing it were okay with that. But yeah, we don't know much more about the customer profile of who's going out and doing the repairs or that sort of thing.
I think you've really hit the nail on the head there, that sharing and circulating, I've written about this, have been features of a functioning society for centuries. There's nothing new there. I think the newness now is that they're organised into different platforms, and there's names for them, isn't there, in a way that there wasn't before. A great, if you have time, obviously, I don't know whether you do or don't, but a great piece about that is Ray Powell's Divisions of Labour. It's a really old book on the Isle of Sheppey, so it's very UK-based. Talks a lot about these sort of reciprocities, mainly between households and on streets, which I think we've lost a little bit of that, but we see a resurgence in these more stranger platform operations where sharing and circulating can occur. But just to pick up on Claudia's point, I think the cultural thing is really interesting. So another thing you might want to read is a very new book called Recycling Class by Manisha Antharam. And that's all about, it's an ethnographic study of the informal waste economies in India, and it picks up on a lot of those different things. A lot of this has been going on for a long time, you know, these different practices of circulating and sharing in different ways, but also around the labours involved in some of that. So, I mean, if you want me to write it down or email me, just let me know and I'll send over the link.
And just quickly as well, the digital aspect I think is really interesting, isn't it? We've kind of mentioned it a little bit in terms of how ideas get circulated, and certainly in the medieval period they'll be very different to today, and then the digital impact. So Daniel Miller is another person to look at in terms of digital sociologies and how that, you know, has a relationship to materiality and so on. So yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, go on.
Thanks for the great session. I'm quite interested in the material recycling, especially for the fashion industry mentioned by the Dr. Claudia. And I just checked the nexus website. They told me they have the technology to do the material recycling. They use the recycled material to make products. They try to recycle the material from the user product. Okay, I get they have paid lots of effort on that. However, actually I can hard, hear about the news that SMEs, small and medium companies, pay efforts on that. Do you think it's a costly practice for SMEs? Is it important those SMEs involved in it? Is it affordable to them? Or alternatively, are there any good practice for them? This is my first question. My second question is, do you think are there any challenges those companies faced? Alternatively, the challenges are from the customer side. So these are my two questions.
So I think like there is quite a few small and medium-sized companies that are actually doing recycling as well, especially for textiles. But again, the challenge is it is expensive. And one thing that also then links to consumption is when we recycle something, it always depends what we put in. So if it's high-graded material that we're putting into a recycling machine, we get high material out of it. If the material in itself is not of high value, you also don't get a high value output. And again, it's kind of like depending, like even though you might recycle something, do you then have to downcycle it, and what do you do with it? So sometimes you might be lucky and it fits in with all the regulations, so you could, for example, get insulation out of it, or you can put it in, I don't know, there's a new company that I've just recently seen, haven't really researched them much, but they make furniture out of, for example, clothing waste. And it's a great idea because then, like obviously something is getting out of it, but at the same time, it is quite hard to do that. And it's quite hard if you think about businesses. Every single business wants to make money. They have to make money because otherwise sustainability also doesn't work, because then you don't have social and you don't have environmental sustainability. If they can't scale it up, for a lot of companies, this is very problematic. And again, also being like actually getting the machinery, or actually being able, if you can't collaborate with someone, but you actually need to purchase everything yourself, it's just a huge financial commitment. So there's also a lot of risk associated with it. But yeah, it does exist in various different degrees. But again, most of the time, it's a challenge with what raw material do you get out of it. And especially for fashion, we also don't know what the repercussions are. So even though you might wear something that is recycled and you think, wow, I'm doing something really great for the environment, if you then hear like how much microfibers are, for example, shed from that specific piece because it was recycled, you sort of like need to think, well, is it better to recycle something or to have even more microfibers in the environment? And we don't have the answer for it. But yeah, it's just like thinking about what are the implications and what do we actually need to do.
Anyone want to pick up the consumer question about, I don't know, in the medieval period, do we have much information about how consumers were impacted by sort of upcycling, reused, that down the line as a cost effect?
I think it's tricky because the main thing we know is that they were probably, consumers were probably more willing to engage with this than the producers and local authorities were to let them, basically. So that seems to be the thing, is that there is some consumer demand, but that there's a feeling that there's barriers to that actually being fulfilled.
How does all impact consumers?
In terms of reuse and... I think people are open to reuse and recycling. I think they're probably also not aware that a lot of the products around us are made from recycled materials, often downcycled, as Claudia's mentioned. But again, I think that comes back to material literacy. I think if they were aware that their garden furniture was made out of plastic bottles, then, well, probably not plastic bottles, probably a lower grade, then they might have something to say about it. But I think people are pretty open to reuse and recycling and repair more than they were before.
So I'm aware of time. So what I'm going to do is just give it back to the floor one more time to these three, just to kind of give any kind of closing thought that you might have for people to leave the room with. So, I don't know, Helen, do you want to go? Any particular thing that you've not covered?
I think something I sort of was going to mention when Claudia was speaking before was about when you talked about the underwear as examples of what people will and won't you have the second hand. There's a temporal distance with that. So I think there's been a bit of research done on how people will wear vintage underwear because there's a time distance, and I always think that is really interesting. And it comes down to that sort of imagined other, doesn't it? Who's had this before and who's worn it, even if you have boil washed it.
This is a whole project,
I know.
isn't it? In terms of,
yeah, and it always fascinates me that vintage underwear apparently is acceptable if it's like, a significant amount of time has passed. I don't know why. Clearly, maybe whatever was on it has gone since then, and maybe that person is no longer around. But I don't know. That was one thing I was going to say that struck me on the knickers conversation.
I suppose that I've obviously mentioned the medieval period in which there's less work, but if you're interested in historical perspective more broadly, there's quite a lot of work out there on later periods. So, for example, Christine Rosen's done some work in business history on meat packing and how that dealt with byproducts from the meat slaughterhouses of Chicago. And also it's worth looking at Jeffrey Jones's work at Harvard Business School because he's done a lot on entrepreneurship in kind of sustainable fields and kind of how there's been quite a few problems as well as successes, but what we can learn from that, which is often, again, about issues to do with changes in government regulations. So, Jeff Jones's work is very easily accessible on Harvard Business School website and is worth a look at because it has a good business perspective and entrepreneurship perspective as well.
I just think interdisciplinary research is the way forward because the more people you have talking to one another from very different fields, the more ideas you get and the more solutions you hopefully find. And with that, I'm also shamelessly promoting. So we've got Creative Manchester, we've got Sustainable Futures, there's Digital Futures, there's all of those different platforms. If you haven't signed up for them, please do. Because there's loads of events like Jenna's, for example, with Helen, obviously, today. And yeah, I think it's the most important thing, just talking to as many people as possible from as many different backgrounds as well.
Wonderfully on message at the end there. So, please give a round of applause for Helen, Catherine and Claudia. Thank you.